On October 22, 2010, the last engine rolled off the line in Kenosha, Wisconsin. No ceremony, no speeches, no crowd gathered outside the gates. Just the sound of machinery going quiet for the first time in 108 years. A few workers signed the final 3.5-liter Phi 6 the way you sign a cast on a broken arm. Because you want to remember, and because you don't know what else to do. Then they shut off the lights and walked out into a Tuesday morning that looked exactly like every other Tuesday morning, except that it wasn't. It was the last one. 108 years. Sit with that number for a moment. The Kenosha factory started building automobiles before Henry Ford had a company, before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, before most of America had electricity in their homes or telephones on their walls. The factory that went quiet on that Tuesday morning in 2010 had been running continuously since 1902, through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the post-war boom, the oil crisis, the Japanese import wave, and 4 complete ownership changes. It had survived everything the 20th century threw at American industry, everything except the people who owned it at the end. At its peak, that factory employed more than 16,000 workers. It produced something approaching 500,000 vehicles a year. It purchased supplies from over 200 Wisconsin companies, stretching from one end of the state to the other. It was the reason families in Kenosha stayed in Kenosha, the reason workers drove in before dawn from northern Illinois, the reason 3 brothers from a single family could spend a combined 120 years on the same assembly floor and call it a life well spent. The factory wasn't just an employer. It was the organizing principle of an entire community. Everything in Kenosha, the schools, the bars, the neighborhoods, the identity, orbited that plant the way planets orbit a sun. And then it was gone. Not because the workers failed, not because the product was inferior. By Chrysler's own internal measurements, the Kenosha plant had the lowest defect rate of any facility in their entire corporation when the decision came down to close it. The best plant, the most efficient, the most productive, closed anyway. That is not a story about market forces. That is a story about choices, specific choices made by specific people, and about what happens to a city when the people making those choices stop caring whether the city survives. This is the full story. How a bicycle maker's gamble turned a Lake Michigan waterfront town into an automotive powerhouse. How an orphaned indentured servant climbed from $1 a day to the presidency of General Motors and then walked away from it all to build something he could call his own. How the workers who built that something fought for the right to be treated as human beings and won. How a company that out-innovated Detroit for 60 years got bought, stripped, and discarded, and how a city decided, twice, that it was not going to let that be the end of the story. Before we go any further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. We get viewers from all over, and I genuinely want to know where this one is landing. If you're new here, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We do deep dives like this every single week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Now, back to Kenosha, back to the very beginning, back to a bicycle maker who saw the future coming and decided he wasn't going to wait for someone else to build it. Kenosha, Wisconsin, 1900. 19. A city on the western shore of Lake Michigan, pressed between Chicago to the south and Milwaukee to the north, like a working man's compromise between the two. Not as loud, not as large, but hungry in a way that both of the bigger cities had forgotten how to be. It had railroad lines running close to the water, lake shipping access to the broader world, and a labor force of immigrant workers who had come looking for something steady and found a city that needed them as badly as they needed it. Polish families, Italian families, German families. They filled the neighborhoods, built the churches, opened the shops, and waited for someone to give them a reason to stay. Thomas B. Jeffery gave them one. Jeffery was a 57-year-old bicycle manufacturer from Chicago who had spent 2 decades building the Gormulli and Jeffery Manufacturing Company into one of the largest bicycle makers in America. He'd made serious money in bicycles. He was also smart enough to know that the bicycle era was ending. Automobiles were arriving and arriving fast, and Jeffery had been experimenting with their design for 3 years before he made his move. In December of 1900, he bought the old Sterling Bicycle Company's factory on the Kenosha waterfront, moved his entire operation down from Chicago, and started converting everything he knew about manufacturing into something new. The original factory building was 600 feet long and 100 feet wide, a single structure close to the railroad lines and the lake, sitting on land that would cost him $65,000. It was not impressive by the standards of what it would become, but it was positioned perfectly. Railroad access for moving raw materials in and finished products out, lake access for shipping to broader markets, room to expand in every direction. Jeffery had not chosen Kenosha by accident. He had chosen it because it was the right place to build something that lasted. In 1902, Thomas Jeffery produced the Rambler. Not the first automobile in America, where Ransom Olds and his Oldsmobile got there a year earlier, but the second mass-produced automobile in the country. 1 full year before Henry Ford built his first Model A in Detroit, a man in Kenosha, Wisconsin was already running a production line. In that first year, Jeffery sold 1,500 Ramblers, 1,500 vehicles. That was 1/6 of every single automobile sold anywhere in the United States in 1902, not 1/6 of the Wisconsin market. 1/6 of the entire country's automobile sales coming out of one factory on the Lake Michigan shoreline. The press noticed, the industry noticed, and the factory grew to match the attention. By 1906, just 4 years into production, Jeffery's Kenosha plant had become the largest and best-equipped automobile factory in the entire nation. Not the Midwest, not the Great Lakes region, the nation. The single building that started at 600 by 100 feet had been supplemented by additional structures until the complex spread across the landscape in a way that made visitors stop and stare. There were over 450 automobile manufacturers operating somewhere in the United States by 1915, and Kenosha's Thomas B. Jeffery Company was comfortably, confidently inside the top 10. Sales peaked in 1914 at 13,513 vehicles. The facility had expanded to cover over 100 acres, including a dedicated test track where engineers pushed new designs to their limits before releasing them to the public. Then Thomas Jeffery died in 1910. His son Charles took over the company and ran it competently, if without his father's founding fire. And then in 1915, Charles Jeffery did something that sounds like the beginning of a different kind of story entirely. He survived the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, the German torpedo that sent that British ocean liner to the bottom of the North Atlantic on May 7, 1915, killed 1,198 people. Charles Jeffery was not among them. He was pulled from the water, wrapped in blankets on a rescue vessel, and sent home to Wisconsin with a different perspective on what his remaining years were worth. Life was too short, he decided, to spend running a company he'd inherited rather than built. He wanted to sell. By 1916, the Jeffery Company had fallen into debt despite its production record. The building was there. The workforce was there. The equipment was there. The reputation, the Rambler name, the manufacturing legacy, the position in the market was absolutely there. What wasn't there was the energy or the capital to push forward. The Jeffery heirs were ready to be done. They just needed someone willing to pay for a dream that was starting to look, from the inside, like a burden. They were about to find exactly the right person. Charles Williams Nash was born on January 28, 1864, in rural Cortland, Illinois, on a struggling farm on what is now Route 38, the Lincoln Highway. His parents were poor in the kind of grinding, structural way that doesn't leave room for sentiment. When Nash was 6 years old, they separated. Both of them walked away, not one parent making a terrible choice. Both parents simultaneously abandoning a 6-year-old child in a farming community in rural Illinois. A court stepped in and bound the boy over as an indentured servant to a farming family in Michigan, under a legal agreement that was supposed to last until he turned 21. He was allowed to attend school for 3 months each year. The other 9 months, he was expected to work. Full agricultural labor, the same backbreaking work the adults did, from a child who had no legal standing to refuse it. At 12 years old, Nash ran away. He found work on other farms in Michigan. Better farms, families that paid him and treated him like a person instead of an asset. And along the way, he learned the carpentry trade. He pressed hay and did farm work, and slowly, methodically, built a set of practical skills in a world that had given him nothing to start with. While pressing hay on the Halleck farm in Grand Blanc, Michigan, he met a young woman named Jessie Halleck. They married on April 23, 1884. Nash was 20 years old. He had nothing except the skills he'd acquired and a disposition that would not accept the idea that his origins defined his ceiling. They moved to Flint, Michigan together in 1890. Nash was hired by William C. Durant's Flint Road Cart Company, later to become the Durant-Dort Carriage Company, as an upholstery stuffer. His starting wage was $1 per day. Within 6 months, Durant had promoted him to factory superintendent. That is not a misprint. 6 months from cushion stuffer to the man running the entire factory floor. Durant recognized what Nash had: a native, intuitive understanding of how manufacturing worked, how to find inefficiency and eliminate it, how to organize people and processes toward a single, productive end. Nash introduced the straight-line belt conveyor into the assembly of carriages at Durant-Dort, an innovation that made production cheaper, faster, and more consistent. The results were measurable and immediate. Durant took note. Within 10 years of being hired as a cushion stuffer, Nash was vice president and general manager of the Durant-Dort Carriage Company. He had gone from legal property to executive leadership in a decade, through nothing but competence, reliability, and a work ethic forged in the hardest possible circumstances. When Durant bought Buick in 1904 and began assembling what would become General Motors, Nash was the man he brought in to oversee production at Buick. Durant didn't care that Nash had no direct automotive experience. He cared that Nash knew how to run a factory and how to manage people, and those skills transferred perfectly. In 1912, Nash hired a rising production expert named Walter P. Chrysler from the American Locomotive Company to serve as Buick's works manager. File that name away. It comes back later, in the worst possible way. Later that same year, William Durant was ousted from the General Motors board for the same reason he'd eventually be ousted again. He'd acquired too much, too fast, financed it badly, and left the company overextended in ways that frightened the bankers, who ultimately controlled everything. The board needed someone steady, someone the financial community trusted, someone who could rebuild GM's internal operations without drama. On November 19, 1912, they elected Charles W. Nash as the 5th president of General Motors. The man who had been bound as a servant at 6 years old, who had run away from an abusive foster household at 12, who had started in manufacturing as a cushion stuffer at $1 a day, that man was now the president of the largest automobile corporation in the world, and he was genuinely good at it. Under Nash's leadership, General Motors' profits quadrupled in 4 years. He consolidated redundant operations that Durant had assembled carelessly, cutting 3 separate truck divisions into one efficient unit, standardizing parts across multiple brands, installing rigorous accounting practices that gave management an actual picture of where money was going and why. He moved GM's general offices from New York to Detroit. He set up the General Motors Export Company to handle international sales systematically. He brought order to a corporation that had been run on Durant's instincts and was nearly destroyed by them. His leadership philosophy was direct. No organization can become of higher caliber than the men who comprise it. His formula for personal success was equally plain: determination, close application to details, plus hard work, and then more hard work. These were not the words of a man who had been given advantages and was performing modesty. These were the distilled conclusions of someone who had built everything he had from a starting position of nothing and who knew exactly which qualities had made the difference. By late 1915, Durant was maneuvering his way back toward control of GM, buying stock quietly through allies and intermediaries until he had reassembled majority voting power. Nash was caught in the resulting power struggle between Durant and the bankers, a position with no comfortable resolution. By May of 1916, Durant had his control back. He offered Nash $1 million a year, $1 million annually in 1916, to stay on and run the company. Nash looked at that number and called it more than a man's worth. He resigned on June 1st, 1916. Think about what that means. A man who had earned $1 a day as an upholstery stuffer, who had slept in Michigan farmhouses and worked harvests for pocket money, who had been sold as a servant as a child, that man, offered $1 million salary, said no. Not because he was foolish, because he had decided, after spending his career building other people's companies, that he would rather own something smaller and honest than manage something vast on someone else's terms. He resolved that day never again to work for another person. He was going to own what he built, or he wasn't going to build it. He had already been paying attention to the Thomas B. Jeffery Company in Kenosha. He knew its history. He knew its capabilities. He knew the Jeffery heirs were ready to sell. Nash moved fast. He paid $500,000 as a down payment, $500,000 from personal funds, written as a check, and structured a total deal worth $5 million. Alfred P. Sloan, who would later become the defining figure of General Motors, was among the first investors in Nash's new venture. The newly incorporated Nash Motors Company was capitalized at nearly $24 million on July 29, 1916. 2 weeks after incorporating, Nash officially resigned from General Motors. He was 52 years old. He had just bought one of the most advanced manufacturing complexes in America. And his first move was to rename it after himself, so that whatever it became, whatever it built, whoever it employed, his name would be on it. Most men who buy something that's struggling try to identify the broken part and fix it. Nash looked at everything Jeffery had built and decided to rebuild the whole enterprise from its operating principles outward. His core commitment was simple and radical in its consistency. Give the customer more than they paid for. Not as a marketing slogan, as a manufacturing standard. Every engineering decision, every supplier negotiation, every quality control choice ran through that single principle. The company wasn't trying to produce the cheapest car in America. It wasn't trying to produce the most expensive. It was trying to produce the most honest, the car that delivered exactly what it promised and then delivered something extra on top of that. The first Nash automobile rolled off the Kenosha line in 1917. The Model 671. It was not a revolutionary vehicle. It was a well-made, well-priced car that did exactly what it was supposed to do. Built in a factory where the workers knew the owner believed they were capable of building something excellent. Sales for 1918 reached 10,283 units. By 1919, with additional models added to the lineup, sales climbed to 27,081. The company had nearly tripled its output in 2 years, in a market that was still fundamentally chaotic and unpredictable. By November of 1924, Nash's plants, in Kenosha, in Racine, in Milwaukee, were operating around the clock, 6 days a week, and Charles Nash announced a $1 million expansion at the original Kenosha facility. Not because he wanted to grow for its own sake, because the factory literally could not build cars fast enough. The company's own internal assessment captured it clearly. For a long time, selling had been 100% a production problem. Every car that could be produced was sold before it left the factory floor. Supply was the constraint. The market wanted more than Nash could make. By 1925, motor vehicle manufacturing had become Wisconsin's single largest industry, and Nash Motors was the largest automaker in the state. The economic footprint of the company spread across the entire region in ways that went far beyond the factory gates. In 1926 alone, Nash purchased supplies from 209 different Wisconsin companies. Businesses in La Crosse in the west, Rhinelander in the north, West Allis to the southeast. This was not a Kenosha company that happened to be located in Wisconsin. This was a Wisconsin institution that employed Wisconsin workers, bought from Wisconsin suppliers, and returned its profits into Wisconsin communities at every level of the production chain. Nash expanded through acquisition, but selectively and shrewdly. In 1923, he bought the bankrupt Mitchell Motors Company of Racine at a bankruptcy auction for $405,000, picking up 500,000 square feet of manufacturing floor space for less than $1 per square foot. The following year, he acquired Lafayette Motors of Milwaukee. Each acquisition followed the same pattern. Identify a distressed competitor with good assets, buy it at distressed pricing, install rigorous financial discipline, fold the productive capacity into the Nash ecosystem, and eliminate whatever was bleeding cash. It was the same approach Nash had used to fix Buick and then to fix General Motors, applied now to his own empire. The Nash Ambassador name first appeared in 1927 as a premium trim designation on the Advance 6 model line. By 1932, it had evolved into a full standalone model, the company's flagship, its most expensive and most refined offering, the car that carried the brand's reputation for quality into the upper medium price range where Nash had always positioned itself most comfortably. Automotive enthusiasts started calling the ambassadors the Kenosha Duesenbergs. That nickname was not casual. A Duesenberg cost $30,000 and was a statement of pure excess for the extraordinarily wealthy. A Nash ambassador cost a fraction of that and delivered an experience of mechanical refinement, interior comfort, and driving quality that made the comparison feel earned rather than exaggerated. Nash had found a way to manufacture genuine quality at a price that the American middle class could actually afford, and the market rewarded them for it consistently. A Nash automobile became the official state car of Wisconsin Governor Julius P. Heil. The brand wasn't just moving product. It had become part of what Wisconsin meant to itself. Then October of 1929 arrived, and the floor fell out of everything. In 1929, Nash was manufacturing 117,000 cars. In 1933, they manufactured 14,973. That is not a slowdown. That is an industry reduced to 1/8 of its former output in 4 years by an economic collapse that wiped out entire companies, entire industries, entire ways of life. But here is what did not happen. Nash did not die. While competitors who had borrowed aggressively to fund expansion were collapsing under debt loads, they couldn't service at reduced sales volumes. Nash's lifelong aversion to leverage, the financial conservatism that had sometimes made investors impatient during the good years, turned out to be exactly the right preparation for catastrophe. The company remained profitable for most of the 1930s, barely in some years, but profitable. In an industry where survival itself was an achievement, Nash was still standing. The Depression years also forced a confrontation Nash had been avoiding. In 1933, emboldened by the National Industrial Recovery Act's provisions supporting collective bargaining, workers at Nash's Kenosha plant organized and formed a federal labor union affiliate. Nash's initial response was delivered with complete clarity. He said he would throw the keys to the Kenosha plant into Lake Michigan before he would sit across a table from a union representative. He meant it. He was not posturing. Charles Nash had built everything he had through individual effort and individual discipline, and he viewed union organization as a challenge to the principles that had made him, and by extension the company, what they were. He eventually changed his position. Federal officials made the legal and political landscape clear enough that continued resistance was not viable. But the history of what happened in Kenosha before Nash capitulated deserves more attention than it typically receives. In September of 1933, workers at the Kenosha plant staged a sit-down strike, stopping work and refusing to leave the factory floor, over a new piecework system that management had imposed unilaterally without negotiation. Labor historians who have examined the record carefully make a compelling argument that this was one of the first uses, possibly the very first use, of the sit-down strike tactic in the American automobile industry. The General Motors sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, the one that became a landmark moment in American labor history, the one that appears in every textbook, came in late 1936 and early 1937, nearly 4 years after Kenosha. The workers who invented the tactic that changed American labor relations were Nash workers in Wisconsin, and almost nobody remembers it. By early 1934, the labor conflict had escalated into a full 7-week strike that shut down Nash plants in Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee simultaneously. Workers refused to return until every facility implemented raises, formal seniority protections, and recognition of union representation. They won all three demands. By June of that year, the three Nash locals, Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee, were pointing with documented pride to the 1934 Nash Lafayette as the first all-union-built automobile in the United States. UAW Local 72, the Kenosha local, would spend the following decades building what became one of the strongest and most carefully maintained union contracts in the entire auto industry. Its members organized baseball teams, sponsored bowling leagues, funded community solidarity drives for other struggling workers across the country, and sent members to the University of Wisconsin School for Workers in Madison for labor education. The union wasn't just a bargaining entity. It was a community institution as rooted in Kenosha as the factory itself. In 1934, even in the depths of the Depression, Nash Motors produced its 1 millionth vehicle, a milestone that most of their competitors from 1929 would never reach because those competitors no longer existed. Charles Nash retired in 1937, selecting George W. Mason of the Kelvinator Appliance Company as his successor and engineering a merger between Nash Motors and Kelvinator that created the Nash Kelvinator Corporation. He moved to Beverly Hills, California, where he lived as one of the wealthiest residents of one of the wealthiest communities in America. He died on June 6, 1948, at the age of 84. His estate was valued at $50 million, approximately $538 million in today's terms. The orphaned farmhand who had started at $1 a day left behind $500 million and a manufacturing empire that bore his name on every car it sold. The gap between where he started and where he ended is one of the more extraordinary spans in American industrial history. He closed it through determination, attention to detail, and more hard work than most people ever attempt. Mason and his engineering team, led by Vice President of Engineering Niels Erik Wahlberg, a former GM engineer who had joined Nash specifically because Nash's approach to vehicle design gave him more freedom than the larger corporations allowed, continued the tradition of technical innovation that Nash had established as a corporate value. In 1938, Nash Kelvinator introduced the first automobile heating and ventilation system whose operating principles are still used in virtually every car manufactured today, not an incremental refinement of existing technology. The foundational design. 17 years before the federal government would begin considering automotive safety standards, Nash was installing seat belts as a standard option in 1950. In 1941, they introduced the Nash 600, named for the 600 miles it could travel on a 20-gallon tank of gas, featuring unibody construction that integrated body and frame into a single structure. That approach to automotive architecture would eventually become the industry standard. Nash got there first by a decade. Then, in early 1942, the last Nash automobile came off the Kenosha line. Workers watched it roll to the end of the floor. Then they retooled, completely, systematically, without hesitation, and started building the machinery of war. This was not Nash Kelvinator's first wartime conversion. During the First World War, Nash had negotiated contracts with the U.S. Army that made the company one of the largest producers of military trucks in the nation. The Jeffery Quad, a four-wheel drive truck developed in Kenosha from 1913 onward, had become essential military transport equipment, with approximately 11,500 units built between 1913 and 1919, serving under severe conditions across multiple theaters. The company had institutional memory of what wartime production required. They did not need to be taught how to pivot. Through 1942 to 1945, the Kenosha plant produced aircraft engines and helicopter components for the Allied forces. The workforce that had built Nash sedans and ambassadors was now building the mechanical heart of military aircraft. Women who had previously been excluded from most production roles stepped into positions vacated by men who had shipped overseas. Not as a temporary accommodation, not as an experiment, but as a demonstration that the exclusions had never been based on capability. They ran machines, they managed assembly processes, They did exactly the work that the situation required, and they did it well. When the war ended, Nash Kelvinator reconverted to civilian production with the practiced competence of a company that had done this before. By 1946, they held 9% of the United States automobile market, a strong position for a company of their size going up against the enormous capital resources of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And then they did something genuinely bold with that position. The Airflight models, developed under Wahlberg from design sketches that independent designers Ted Peach and Bob Cotto had prepared in 1943, represented a complete rethinking of what an American car should look like. Wind tunnel tested for aerodynamic efficiency, something almost no American manufacturer was doing in the late 1940s, the Airflight had a smooth, pontoon-like body with enclosed front fenders, a profile that sat 6 inches lower than its predecessor models, while somehow delivering more interior room. Automotive journalists at the time called it the most alarming design since the Chrysler Airflow. Critics called it an inverted bathtub and meant it as an insult. Buyers bought it anyway because it was more modern, more efficient, and more thoughtfully engineered than anything Detroit was producing at the comparable price point. The car that looked wrong turned out to drive right, and the market eventually agreed. In 1950, Nash added a U.S.-built compact automobile to the lineup, the first in the country, in a segment that Detroit had decided wasn't worth pursuing because small cars meant thin margins. George Romney, who had become Nash Kelvinator's last CEO and then the first CEO of the successor company, believed in the compact as the future of American driving. He was correct. He was also about 15 years ahead of the moment when the market was ready to admit it. By the early 1950s, the financial pressure on independent automakers had become structural rather than cyclical. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, the big three, had accumulated advantages in supply chain integration, dealer network scale, capital access, and regulatory relationships that were no longer simply about being bigger. They were about being so much bigger that the gap had become unbridgeable by a company operating at Nash Kelvinator scale. An independent automaker could be excellent, could out-engineer, out-design, out-innovate the giants in specific areas, and still be squeezed to death by economics that had nothing to do with the quality of the product. George Mason saw the math clearly. In January of 1954, Nash Kelvinator announced the acquisition of the Hudson Motor Company, another respected independent that faced the same structural squeeze, in a friendly merger that would create American Motors Corporation. Mason's logic was straightforward. Two struggling independents together could survive the economics that would individually kill both of them. All production would be consolidated at the Kenosha plant beginning with the 1955 model year. Kenosha would become the primary manufacturing center of the last significant independent automobile manufacturer in America. Mason died later in 1954, before the full merger was realized. George Romney took over and executed the strategy, though he made a significant adjustment to the focus. While Detroit was building longer, lower, and wider cars with increasingly powerful engines and decreasing fuel economy, chasing a vision of automotive excess that the post-war prosperity boom had made briefly appealing, Romney pushed the Rambler compact, practical, efficient, honest about what most American families actually needed from a car. It was a deeply unfashionable position in the mid-1950s. It became the right one when the 1958 recession hit, and suddenly the Rambler was the most economically sensible vehicle available at any American dealership. The 1963 AMC Rambler was named Motor Trend Car of the Year. We're 20 years to the month after the original Rambler had won the same recognition. The factory in Kenosha had produced back-to-back Car of the Year winners, 2 decades apart. A different car, a different era, a different company name on the letterhead. The same factory floor, the same workers, or their children. By the 1960s, American Motors Corporation was running at operational peak in Kenosha. 500,000 vehicles a year, 16,000 workers. Morning commutes feeding the plant from as far north as Milwaukee and as far south as Waukegan, Illinois. Workers making the drive before dawn because the job in Kenosha was worth it. 3 shifts. The complex had grown into a full industrial city contained within city limits. A main plant and a lakefront plant working in concert, connected by infrastructure that moved components and assemblies between buildings, supported by a dedicated internal television station that produced programming for the breakroom TVs throughout the facility. One employee maintained the tape library. When he died decades later, his wife donated the tapes to the Kenosha History Center, footage of a world that no longer existed, preserved almost by accident. Families had been in those buildings for 2 and 3 generations. The Wojciechowicz brothers, John, Ted, and Dan, worked in the inspection department at American Motors through the AMC years and into the Renault and Chrysler eras, accumulating a combined 120 years of service between the 3 of them by the time they retired. That is not a statistic. That is 3 human lives organized around a single institution, a commitment made across decades that the institution was supposed to honor in return. AMC's market share never quite reached the target of 3.7% that management had set as the threshold for sustainable independence, but the company was building real cars for real people and doing it well. If the 1960s belonged to muscle cars and the counterculture, American Motors decided to be both at once and apologized to nobody. They couldn't fight Detroit on Detroit's financial terms, couldn't match the advertising budgets, couldn't absorb losses on experimental models the way GM could, couldn't fund development programs that ran for years before producing a saleable vehicle. So they stopped trying to fight on those terms. The Javelin in 1968 was AMC's pony car entry, genuinely competitive with the Ford Mustang and the Chevrolet Camaro in performance specifications, built on a fraction of the development investment those cars had required. The AMX was the only American-made 2-seat domestic sports car in production at the time. Not Ford, not GM, not Chrysler. AMC out of Kenosha, Wisconsin. They built it because nobody else would, and because the engineering team believed they could. In 1969, American Motors made the acquisition that would define its final chapter in ways nobody fully understood at the time. They bought the Jeep brand from Kaiser Industries. At the moment of purchase, it looked like exactly the lifeline the company needed. A brand with genuine global recognition, authentic off-road credibility built over decades of military and civilian use, and a loyal customer base that didn't compete with AMC's existing market segments. It was a lifeline. It just came with a blade hidden inside it. Because the thing that made Jeep valuable was exactly the thing that would eventually make AMC attractive to a buyer who had no interest in keeping Kenosha alive. The 1970s brought the cars that everyone remembers, and fewer people actually loved in the moment. The Gremlin in 1970, America's first subcompact, launched deliberately on April 1st of that year with either marketing genius or corporate self-awareness. It remains genuinely unclear which. The Hornet, the Matador, the Pacer in 1975, the widest American compact ever built, designed originally around a Wankel rotary engine that Renault ultimately decided not to deliver. So AMC's engineers substituted a conventional inline-six and sold the car anyway as a revolutionary design statement. The jokes about the Pacer wrote themselves and never quite stopped. The car sold well enough to matter and polarized opinion completely, which, for AMC, was better than being ignored. Profits reached $44.5 million in 1973, the best performance since 1960. The oil crisis that followed made Romney's original compact car argument look prophetic. For about 18 months, AMC was the most prescient automaker in America. Then a costly 3-week strike in 1974 took a significant bite out of revenue. And 1975, a year when the rest of the U.S. auto industry recorded some of its best profits in history, was a loss year for AMC. The company was always slightly out of phase with the broader market. When the industry got fat, AMC was lean. When the industry had to get lean, AMC was already stretched past its limits. In 1984, Ron Howard came to Kenosha scouting locations for a film called Gung Ho, a movie about an American automotive factory taken over by Japanese management. about the cultural collision and the fear and the impossible negotiations between workers who had built their lives around an institution and executives who saw that institution as a balance sheet entry. Howard walked those assembly floors, looked at those production lines, studied the relationship between the factory and the city outside its walls, and decided Kenosha was the right backdrop for his story. The workers let him film there. It is unclear whether anyone paused to consider the specific irony of an American factory city agreeing to stand in for a story about an American factory city being bought by foreign management, while the actual factory was already in the process of being bought by foreign management. American Motors was doing everything right and still bleeding. They had out-innovated Detroit on fuel economy, out-designed them on concept and category creation, and out-hustled them on thin margins for 3 decades. None of it was enough to overcome the structural economics of competing with companies that had 10 times the capital. By the late 1970s, AMC needed a partner, a savior, or an obituary. In 1979, French automaker Renault arrived with a checkbook and offered to be the first 2 of those things. Renault took 46.1% of American Motors in what was officially described as a strategic partnership and functionally operated as a rescue. Their intention was transparent from the start: use AMC's 1,300 dealer network to distribute Renault vehicles in American showrooms. Use AMC's Kenosha manufacturing capacity to build those vehicles domestically, and in the process, give Renault the American foothold it had been unable to establish on its own. Kenosha workers didn't know what to make of French management, different work culture, different organizational assumptions, different ideas about what a labor relationship should look like. But the alternative to an awkward partnership with Renault was the end of AMC entirely, and the end of AMC meant the end of 16,000 jobs. So, they adapted. In September of 1982, the partnership produced its first new vehicle, the Renault Alliance, built in Kenosha. Marketed as European technology made affordable and assembled in America, it was essentially a Renault 9. A front-wheel drive compact that had been mildly restyled by AMC designer Dick Teague to meet American safety requirements and appeal to American tastes. In 1983, the Renault Alliance was named Motor Trend Car of the Year. 3,000 workers who had been laid off came back to the Kenosha plant. People who had been living on reduced income watching the factory shrink around them were back on the floor. There was genuine relief in Kenosha. There was something that felt cautiously like a future. That feeling lasted less than 2 years. Renault lost $1.35 billion in 1984. 10 times the loss they had posted in 1983. Their American sales were declining. The partnership that had seemed like salvation was consuming more French capital than Renault's board was willing to authorize. In 1985, Renault lost another $770 million and determined that AMC needed approximately $100 million in fresh capital to survive. Renault decided it would not send more money across the Atlantic. AMC was on its own. Inside the Kenosha plant, during these years, the atmosphere had deteriorated. Workers who had accepted wage concessions as part of the Renault rescue deal were watching management fail to deliver the wage increases that had been promised in return. The anger expressed itself in the way anger expresses itself on a factory floor, in small acts of resistance, in work slowdowns, in the kind of low-level institutional friction that makes a production line less efficient, even when no single person is obviously at fault. 3 union activists, John Drew, John Melrod, and Todd Anstad, had been sued by plant supervisors over a newsletter called The Fighting Times, which accused supervisors of racism, sexism, and harassment. The case went to trial in October of 1983. Dozens of workers testified. The jury sided with the activists. AMC was ordered to cover their legal fees, and the 3 became figures of considerable standing on the factory floor. Rumors were circulating openly by 1986 and into 1987. The Kenosha plant was going to be shut down. Management denied it. Every denial made the workers trust management a little less than they had the day before. Then Chrysler came through the door. On March 9, 1987, Chrysler agreed to purchase Renault's share of American Motors plus all remaining shares for approximately $1.5 billion, while assuming AMC's outstanding debt of $700 million. Lee Iacocca's statement to the Los Angeles Times the following morning was explicit about what Chrysler was acquiring. Jeep, the best-known automotive brand name in the world, he called it, plus the new Rambler assembly plant in Canada, plus AMC's dealer network. That was the list he gave. Kenosha was not on it. UAW Local 72 members celebrated anyway. Chrysler was American. Iacocca was the man who had famously saved Chrysler from bankruptcy with a federal loan guarantee and his own force of personality, the man who had written the book on American manufacturing comebacks. If he was coming to Kenosha, people told themselves, it meant Kenosha was safe. The workforce tripled to 6,100 workers as production ramped up. The first Chrysler vehicle came off the Kenosha line on September 8, 1987. People thought it was a new chapter. It was a countdown. Then January 27, 1988 arrived, and Kenosha's world ended. Chrysler's announcement was this: car production at the Kenosha assembly plant would stop at the end of the 1988 model year. 5,500 workers would lose their jobs by summer. That number, 5,500 people, represented 10% of the entire employed workforce of Kenosha County. Not 10% of factory workers, 10% of every working person in the county, gone in a single corporate decision announced on a Wednesday morning. The workers had something they believed was a guarantee. A letter dated June 26, 1987, written on Chrysler letterhead, signed by James Kilroy, manager of state relations for Chrysler Corporation. The letter stated in plain, unambiguous language, based upon our current product plans, it is our intention to maintain production of our L-body vehicles for at least 5 years, 1988 through 1992, in the present American Motors facilities located in your city. A written commitment. 6 months old, signed on letterhead. Wisconsin State Senator Joseph Andrea said what everyone on the floor was thinking. I thought a 5-year agreement was a 5-year agreement. Chrysler's public defense was that market conditions had changed, that the commitment was subject to demand, that the language of the letter carried different obligations than the words in the letter actually conveyed. It was the kind of corporate argument that sounds plausible in a legal brief and feels like a knife in the stomach to someone who made a decision about their mortgage based on what the letter said. Here is what made it, specifically, precisely worse. The Kenosha plant had recently set a quality record, the lowest defect rate of any facility in the entire Chrysler Corporation. Management had acknowledged this achievement. The acknowledgement had taken the form of free coffee and soda for the workers for 1 day. 1 day of free beverages as recognition for being the best manufacturing plant in the company. Then, within months, the announcement that the best manufacturing plant in the company was being closed. Workers were not confused about what this meant. They understood it completely and immediately. Their quality had nothing to do with the decision. The decision had been made on different grounds entirely. UAW Local 72 Chairman Rudy Kuzel dispatched union members to follow Lee Iacocca around the country, showing up at his appearances carrying signs that read, "Iacocca lied." He told the Wall Street Journal exactly what he thought of the man who had promised to save Kenosha, and then closed it. Lee Iacocca represents what's wrong with corporate America. He doesn't care any more about America than Joe Stalin did. The comparison was volcanic. The fury behind it was completely earned. Chrysler's own book on the closure, written years later, acknowledged privately that the economically logical decision would have been to close an aging Detroit plant instead of Kenosha. Iacocca's loyalty to Detroit, to the city whose identity he had built his career around, appears to have weighed against a Wisconsin city that had done nothing wrong. Presidential candidate Jesse Jackson came to Kenosha and spoke at a rally with a Chrysler overpass on 52nd Street as his backdrop and laid off workers in the crowd. Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson directed his attorney general to investigate whether the state had legal grounds to sue Chrysler. The story became national news, a case study in the specific kind of corporate betrayal that leaves a community with no recourse and no explanation, that makes the math work out differently. Iacocca eventually announced a compensation fund, eventually totaling $220 million, to help displaced workers find new footing. The state of Wisconsin negotiated a separate arrangement, a trust fund built from Chrysler's profits on every vehicle sold in Wisconsin during the 1988 model year. That fund reached $23.6 million. Nearly $9 million of it went to education for workers and their families over the following decade, an approach so effective that economists studying deindustrialization later pointed to the Kenosha model as a template for other cities facing the same disaster. None of it changed what December 23, 1988 felt like. The last car came off the Kenosha assembly line, a maroon Dodge Omni. Workers signed it the way you sign something you know you're never going to see again. The line went dark. 11 million vehicles over 86 years of automobile production in that building. And it ended with a compact car that nobody had asked for, built by workers who had earned the right to build something they could be proud of. On June 29, 1990, the 250-foot smokestack at the lakefront plant was brought down in a controlled demolition. The explosion was visible for miles across the flat Wisconsin landscape. The last piece of the skyline that had defined industrial Kenosha for nearly a century was gone in approximately 4 seconds. 5,863 jobs, an unemployment rate that jumped to 12% overnight. But the assembly plant was not quite the end. In the industrial interior of Kenosha, away from the lake, away from the television cameras, the engine plant on 30th Avenue kept running. 1,000 workers remained after the assembly closure, producing the engines that went into Jeep Cherokees, Chrysler 300s, and Dodge vehicles. The legendary AMC 4.0-liter inline six, an engine that would power Jeep Cherokees for decades and develop a devoted following among off-road enthusiasts worldwide, was born in Kenosha. In 2006, 1,300 workers were still employed at the engine plant, and the facility was rated among the top-performing Chrysler operations in the country by the Harbor Report, the industry's standard productivity benchmark. In 2007, Chrysler announced it was investing $450 million to retool the Kenosha engine plant for a new V6 engine, internally designated the Phoenix. $450 million is not a gesture of continuity. It is a capital commitment. Workers who had watched the assembly plant close 19 years earlier allowed themselves to believe that this time the promise was real, that Kenosha was finally going to be okay. Then Chrysler went bankrupt in 2009. On February 2nd of that year, Chrysler offered buyout packages to hourly workers at plants across the corporation. The Kenosha plant employees were specifically excluded from that offer, not overlooked in an administrative error, specifically deliberately excluded. On May 1, 2009, Chrysler announced the Kenosha engine plant would close by the end of 2010. Hundreds of workers rallied outside. They appealed to the Obama administration. They appealed to Fiat executives who were taking over the restructured Chrysler. The arguments they made were the same ones Rudy Kuzel had made in 1988. The plant was excellent, the workers were the best, the closure made no sense on manufacturing grounds. After Chrysler emerged from Chapter 11 as a Fiat-controlled entity in June of 2009, the Kenosha plant briefly restarted. Then in August of 2010, the final closure was confirmed, 575 remaining jobs. On October 22, 2010, the date we started with, the last engine was produced. No ceremony, no speeches. 108 years of automotive manufacturing in Kenosha, from the first Rambler in 1902 to a 3.5-liter V6 on a Tuesday morning. Over. Demolition began in December of 2012. Cleanup was completed by the spring of 2013. In February of 2014, the legal entity holding the former Chrysler assets abandoned the property. The city of Kenosha accepted title to 107 acres of contaminated industrial land in the middle of its downtown, with a $30 million environmental remediation price tag and $10 million in federal relief money to begin addressing it. Kenosha had been through this before, not with this scale, but with this kind of choice. When the assembly plant closed in 1988, the city had not waited for someone to tell them what to do. Community leaders formed the Kenosha transition team immediately and began planning before the last car was off the line. They negotiated the $23.6 million trust fund from Chrysler. They mapped a future for the 31-acre lakefront site that wasn't a parking lot or a memorial. By 1990, all the assembly plant buildings had been cleared. By the mid-90s, redevelopment was underway. Today, that 69-acre stretch of former factory land along the Lake Michigan shoreline is Harbor Park. Condominiums, museums, a streetcar line, walking and biking paths, a neighborhood that draws residents and visitors to a waterfront that once smelled of industrial exhaust and machine oil. The transformation is real, and it took genuine civic will across multiple decades to make it happen. The engine plant site was harder, bigger, more contaminated, more central. The city and its partners eventually developed the Kenosha Innovation Neighborhood, a master-planned redevelopment of the 107-acre former AMC and Chrysler engine plant site that received approximately $158.6 million in total investment. In October of 2025, the $23.5 million Kenosha Innovation Center opened on the ground where 14,000 people once built engines. It houses startups and entrepreneurs. It partners with Gateway Technical College on workforce development. Future phases include 800 to 1,300 residential units, mixed-use commercial development, and medical facilities. The site that produced the second mass-produced automobile in America is being asked now to produce the next generation of something. The Kenosha History Center keeps the record. A 1902 Rambler Model C sits on display alongside the 1917 Nash Model 671, the first car to carry the name of the man who bought the factory with a $500,000 check. A plaque stands at 25th Avenue and 56th Street, marking the spot where the Jeffery, Nash, AMC, and Chrysler plant once stood. The Kenosha Homecoming Car Show, believed to be the largest AMC-focused car show in the world, returns in July of 2028. What Kenosha built in the factory's place is genuine. The lakefront is beautiful. The Innovation Center is real. The city's documented resilience, cited by economists, studied by urban planners, referenced by other communities that have faced the same disaster, is not a consolation story. It is a real achievement. But 16,000 workers is not the same as a startup incubator. 100 years of generational employment is not the same as a co-working space with venture capital tenants. The people who lost those jobs in 1988, the machinists and assemblers and inspectors and line workers who had built their mortgages and their retirements and their children's futures around a steady factory wage, many of them never found equivalent work. Many of them never recovered fully. The economic data that shows Kenosha eventually bouncing back to 6.5% unemployment by 1992 does not capture what the intervening years cost those specific people in specific, irreversible ways. Charles Nash started with nothing that the world recognizes as valuable. No parents who claimed him. No education that lasted more than 3 months a year. No connections. No name that anyone had heard of. He built something from that nothing. Built it on the principle that workers deserved to work for something honest, that customers deserved a product that gave them more than they paid for, that a company could be excellent and financially disciplined and humane all at the same time without any of those qualities contradicting the others. He ran his company on those terms for roughly 20 years, and it worked. Then he retired, and the people who followed him were good at some of what he had been good at and gradually forgot the rest. Every subsequent owner moved the company a little further from that founding principle. Mason and Romney still carried something of it, still treated Kenosha as something worth protecting, still built honest cars for the people who deserved them. Then the mergers came, and the French partners arrived with their different calculus. And eventually Lee Iacocca walked through the door with a list of what Chrysler was actually buying. And what Chrysler was actually buying did not include the workers who had built the best defect rate in the corporation. It did not include the city that had organized its entire economy around the factory for 8 decades. It did not include the 108 years of accumulated craft and knowledge sitting on that assembly floor. What happened to Kenosha was not an accident of market forces. It was a series of choices, specific choices made by specific people to prioritize things that were not the workers, not the city, and not the product. Wisconsin did not lose its automotive crown because it couldn't build cars. The Kenosha workers were, by the company's own records, the best builders in the corporation. They lost the crown because the people at the top stopped asking whether what they were doing was right and settled for asking only whether it was profitable. That lesson was available in 1988 when the maroon Dodge Omni came off the line and the workers signed it. It was available in 2010 when the last engine turned and the lights went off. It is available right now in every decision made by every company that employs people in a place that has built its life around that employment. Success is fragile. The crown can be built over a century and lost in a decade. And the people who build it, who gave a combined 120 years between three brothers, who drove in before dawn from across the state line, who invented the sit-down strike 4 years before Flint and never got credit for it. They deserved better than a day of free coffee and a letter that didn't mean what it said. That is what the plaque at 25th and 56th doesn't say. But it is there, in the silence where the factory used to be.